Sarah Mitchell wiped down the counter of Seaside Café for the third time that morning, her nervous energy making it impossible to stay still. The small coastal cafe had been her life for the past 8 years, ever since she'd taken over from the previous owner who couldn't make ends meet. The smell of fresh coffee and bacon filled the air, mixing with the salty breeze that drifted through the open windows overlooking the harbor. At 34, Sarah had built something she was proud of. The cafe wasn't fancy, but it was warm and welcoming. Local fishermen stopped by for their morning coffee before heading out to sea. Tourists loved the homemade scones and the view of the boats bobbing in the harbor. She knew every regular customer by name and their usual order by heart. The morning rush was winding down when she noticed him. A security guard from the nearby naval base sat alone at a corner table, staring out at the water with hollow eyes. His uniform was wrinkled, and his shoulders sagged with exhaustion. Sarah had seen him before, always alone, always looking like he carried the weight of the world. His name was Marcus Thompson, and he'd been coming to the cafe for about 6 months. He never said much beyond ordering his coffee and toast, but Sarah could see something was wrong. Today was different, though. Today, Marcus looked broken. Sarah approached his table with a fresh pot of coffee. "Would you like a refill, Marcus?" He looked up, surprised that she remembered his name. Yes, please, thank you, Sarah." His voice was barely above a whisper. As she poured the coffee, Sarah noticed his hands shaking. "Are you all right? You look like you haven't slept in days." Marcus laughed bitterly. "Sleep? I wish I could. It's just, everything's falling apart." He rubbed his face with both hands. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't be bothering you with my problems." "Hey, that's what we're here for," Sarah said, pulling up a chair. The cafe was nearly empty now, just an elderly couple reading newspapers by the window. Sometimes talking helps. Marcus hesitated, then the words came pouring out. His wife had left him 3 months ago, taking their 7-year-old daughter with her. The divorce was getting ugly, and his ex-wife was demanding alimony he couldn't afford. His mother was in the hospital with cancer, and the medical bills were piling up. To make matters worse, he'd been working double shifts at the base just to stay afloat, but it wasn't enough. "I haven't eaten a proper meal in 2 days," he admitted, his voice cracking. "I keep telling myself things will get better, but I don't know how much longer I can hold on." Sarah's heart ached for him. She'd been through her own struggles when she first took over the cafe. There were nights she'd gone to bed hungry, wondering if she'd have to close down, but the community had supported her, and now it was her turn to pass that kindness forward. "Wait here," she said, standing up. She disappeared into the kitchen and returned with a plate piled high with food: fresh eggs, crispy bacon, buttered toast, and a bowl of homemade soup. She set it down in front of Marcus along with a glass of orange juice. "Sarah, I can't." "I don't have enough money for all this," Marcus protested, his eyes welling up. "Who said anything about money?" Sarah smiled. "This is what neighbors do for each other. Eat up." Marcus stared at the food, then at Sarah, then back at the food. When he finally took a bite, tears rolled down his cheeks. "I don't know how to thank you," he whispered. "Just take care of yourself," Sarah replied. "And remember, you're not alone." For the next hour, Marcus ate slowly, savoring every bite. Sarah checked on him occasionally while serving other customers, but mostly gave him space. When he was finished, he looked like a different person. The color had returned to his face, and his shoulders didn't seem so heavy. "Sarah," he said as she cleared his plate, "you've given me hope when I thought there was none left. I'll never forget this kindness. Just pay it forward when you can," she said with a warm smile. Marcus nodded, stood up, and straightened his uniform. He looked more like the proud security guard he was supposed to be. "I better get back to base. Thank you again for everything." As he walked toward the door, Sarah called out, "Marcus, you're welcome here anytime. And if you ever need someone to talk to, you know where to find me." He turned back with a grateful smile and a small salute before disappearing into the afternoon sunshine. Sarah watched him go, feeling good about what she'd done. She'd always believed that small acts of kindness could change someone's day, maybe even their life. Her grandmother had taught her that principle, and it had served her well in building her business and her relationships in the community. The rest of the afternoon passed quietly. The elderly couple left, and a few tourists stopped by for ice cream and cold drinks. Sarah hummed to herself as she worked, thinking about Marcus and hoping things would start looking up for him. She had no idea that her simple act of kindness would soon change everything. She couldn't know that Marcus wasn't just any security guard, or that the naval base where he worked was home to some of the most elite military units in the country. She certainly couldn't have predicted that her generosity would reach the ears of people who had the power to turn her small cafe into the center of an extraordinary story. As the sun began to set over the harbor, casting golden light through the cafe windows Sarah cleaned up for the day, she felt peaceful, content with her decision to help Marcus. It was the right thing to do, regardless of any consequences. Tomorrow would bring new customers, new stories, and new opportunities to make a difference in someone's day. Sarah locked up the cafe and headed home, completely unaware that her act of kindness had already set in motion a chain of events that would soon bring unexpected visitors to her quiet, seaside establishment. The next morning brought gray clouds and the promise of rain. Sarah arrived at the cafe early as usual, flipping the sign to "Open" just as the first fishermen began making their way down to the harbor. She'd slept well, feeling good about helping Marcus the day before. She was preparing the morning's first batch of scones when Mrs. Henderson, the cafe's part-time waitress, rushed through the door with wide eyes and a concerned expression. "Sarah, dear, you need to see this," Mrs. Henderson said, waving her phone. "It's about that security guard you helped yesterday." Sarah wiped her flour-covered hands on her apron and took the phone. On the screen was a local news article with the headline, "Security Guard Prevents Major Security Breach at Naval Base." Her heart skipped a beat as she read further. The article described how Marcus Thompson had discovered and reported a serious security threat at the base the previous evening. According to the report, his quick thinking and attention to detail had potentially prevented unauthorized access to classified areas. The base commander was quoted as saying it was one of the most significant security saves in recent memory. "He did all this after leaving here yesterday?" Sarah asked, amazed. "That's not even the best part," Mrs. Henderson said, taking back her phone and scrolling down. "Look at this interview they did with him this morning." Sarah read Marcus's words with growing surprise. He credited his alertness and clear thinking to "an angel at Seaside Cafe who reminded me what kindness looks like and gave me the strength to keep going when I thought I had nothing left." "Oh my," Sarah whispered. "I just gave him some food. He did the real work." But Mrs. Henderson wasn't finished. "There's more, love. Apparently, word about what you did has spread around the base. People are talking about the cafe owner who helped one of their own when he was down and out." Sarah felt a flutter of nervousness. She hadn't helped Marcus for recognition or reward. She'd done it because it was the right thing to do. The idea of attention made her uncomfortable. "I hope this doesn't turn into a big deal," she said, returning to her scones. "I just want to run my cafe in peace." Mrs. Henderson patted her shoulder. "You're a good person, Sarah. Sometimes good deeds have a way of coming back around." The morning proceeded normally enough. The usual customers came and went, though a few mentioned seeing the news story and congratulated Sarah on her kindness. She tried to change the subject each time, focusing instead on their orders and the weather. Around mid-morning, Sarah noticed a black sedan parked across the street. It had been there for about an hour, which was unusual. The harbor area didn't typically attract that kind of vehicle, and the occupants seemed to be watching the cafe rather than enjoying the view. "Mrs. Henderson," Sarah called to her employee who was wiping down tables. "Do you see that car over there, the black one?" Mrs. Henderson squinted through the window. "Oh yes, I noticed it earlier. Probably just tourists, dear. Sometimes people like to sit and watch the boats." But Sarah wasn't convinced. Something about the car made her uneasy. The windows were tinted and it seemed too official, too deliberate in its positioning. Her concerns were interrupted by the arrival of a familiar figure. Marcus Thompson walked through the cafe door, but he looked different than the day before. His uniform was crisp and clean, his posture straight and confident. Most notably, he wasn't alone. Behind him walked a stern-looking woman in a business suit. She had short gray hair, sharp eyes, and the bearing of someone used to being in charge. Sarah immediately felt intimidated. "Sarah," Marcus said, approaching the counter with a mixture of gratitude and embarrassment. "I wanted to introduce you to someone. This is Commander Patricia Walsh from the Naval Base." Commander Walsh stepped forward with a professional smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Ms. Mitchell, I understand you provided assistance to Guard Thompson yesterday." "I just gave him some food," Sarah said carefully. "He looked like he needed a friend." "Yes, well, your assistance has created quite a situation," Commander Walsh said, her tone neutral but somehow disapproving. "Guard Thompson's performance yesterday was exemplary, and he's been commended for his actions. However, there are concerns about security personnel accepting charity from civilians." Sarah felt her cheeks burn. "Charity? I was just being neighborly." "I'm sure your intentions were good," Commander Walsh continued, "but we have strict protocols about our personnel's interactions with the public. There are concerns about potential security risks, conflicts of interest, and the appearance of impropriety." Marcus looked uncomfortable. "Commander, with respect, Sarah was just helping someone who needed it. There was nothing improper about it." Commander Walsh's expression hardened. "Guard Thompson, you're already on thin ice due to your personal circumstances affecting your work performance. I suggest you don't make this situation worse by arguing with me." Sarah felt anger rising in her chest. "Now wait just a minute. Marcus hasn't done anything wrong and neither have I. I own this cafe and I can serve whoever I want." "Actually, Ms. Mitchell, that's where you're mistaken," Commander Walsh said coolly. "The naval base is a significant presence in this community, and we have considerable influence over local businesses. We prefer to work with establishments that understand and respect our security requirements." The threat was subtle but clear. Sarah felt her world tilting. The naval base personnel made up a significant portion of her customer base, especially during the busy summer months. If they decided to boycott her cafe or discourage others from coming, it could ruin her business. "What exactly are you saying?" Sarah asked, though she was afraid she already knew. "I'm saying that perhaps it would be best for everyone if Guard Thompson found somewhere else to take his meals, and perhaps you should consider whether your approach to customer service aligns with the security needs of our installation." Marcus stepped forward. "Commander, this isn't right. Sarah doesn't deserve this kind of treatment." "Guard Thompson, you're dismissed," Commander Walsh snapped. "Return to base immediately. We'll discuss your insubordination later." Marcus looked at Sarah with an expression of helpless apology. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I never wanted this to happen." "It's not your fault," Sarah assured him, though her voice was shaking. After Marcus reluctantly left, Commander Walsh remained for a moment longer. "Ms. Mitchell, I trust we understand each other. Good day." Sarah watched the woman leave, her hands trembling with a mixture of fear and outrage. Mrs. Henderson, who had been pretending to clean tables while listening to every word, rushed over. "Sarah, that was terrible. They can't treat you like that, just for being kind. Can't they?" Sarah asked bitterly. "She made it pretty clear what would happen if I don't play along." As Commander Walsh got into the black sedan and drove away, Sarah sank onto a stool behind the counter. Her act of kindness had backfired spectacularly. Not only was Marcus in trouble at work, but her own livelihood was now under threat. "What am I going to do?" she asked Mrs. Henderson. "You're going to keep being the good person you've always been," Mrs. Henderson replied firmly. "Some battles are worth fighting, even when the odds are against you." Sarah wasn't so sure. As she looked out at the harbor where Marcus had found his strength the day before, she wondered if her kindness had doomed them both. The week that followed was one of the worst in Sarah's 8 years of running the cafe. Commander Walsh's threat had been subtle but effective. Word seemed to spread quickly among the naval base personnel that Seaside Cafe was no longer a preferred establishment. The change was immediate and devastating. Sarah's regular customers from the base stopped coming. The morning rush that used to include dozens of uniformed personnel dwindled to just a handful of locals and tourists. Even some of the civilian contractors who worked at the base began avoiding the cafe. Mrs. Henderson did her best to keep spirits up, but Sarah could see the worry in her elderly employee's eyes. Maybe it's just a coincidence, she'd say hopefully. Maybe they're just busy with training exercises or something. But Sarah knew better. She'd run this business long enough to recognize a boycott when she saw one. Her daily receipts had dropped by nearly 60%, and it was only getting worse. On Thursday morning, as Sarah was preparing for another slow day, she heard the bell above the door chime. She looked up hopefully, only to see two men in expensive suits walking in. They didn't look like tourists or locals, and something about their demeanor made Sarah immediately wary. "Ms. Mitchell?" the taller of the two men asked. He had perfectly styled gray hair and a smile that seemed more practiced than genuine. "I'm Richard Blackwood from Coastal Development Corporation, and this is my associate, Mr. Stevens." "We're not interested in selling," Sarah said quickly. She'd heard of Coastal Development Corporation. They bought up small businesses along the coast and turned them into chain restaurants or expensive condos. "Oh, please don't be so hasty," Mr. Blackwood said smoothly. "We understand you've been having some difficulties lately. Business challenges, problems with certain customers. We're here to offer you a solution." Sarah felt her stomach drop. "How do you know about my business?" Mr. Stevens, a shorter man with beady eyes, spoke up for the first time. "Word travels fast in a small community, Ms. Mitchell. We hear the naval base personnel have been redirecting their business elsewhere. That must be very difficult for someone in your position. We're prepared to make you a very generous offer for your property," Mr. Blackwood continued, pulling out a folder from his briefcase. "More than generous, actually. Enough for you to relocate anywhere you'd like and start fresh." Sarah looked at the paperwork he'd placed on the counter. The numbers were indeed generous, far more than she'd expected her little cafe to be worth. But there was something sinister about the timing. "This is awfully convenient," she said suspiciously. "My business has problems for 1 week, and suddenly you show up with an offer to buy me out?" Mr. Blackwood's smile faltered slightly. "We've been monitoring properties in this area for some time, Ms. Mitchell. We simply thought now might be an opportune moment for both of us." "You mean you thought I'd be desperate enough to sell cheap?" Sarah said, her anger building. "Well, you're wrong. This cafe isn't for sale at any price." Mr. Stevens leaned forward. "Ms. Mitchell, perhaps you don't understand the reality of your situation. Without the base personnel as customers, how long can you really survive? Another month? 2 months? By then, you'll be lucky to get half what we're offering now." "Are you threatening me?" Sarah asked. "Not at all," Mr. Blackwood said quickly. "We're simply pointing out economic realities. But there are other considerations as well. Zoning issues, health department inspections, building code violations. Sometimes these small businesses face unexpected challenges that make operation difficult." The threat was clear. If she didn't sell voluntarily, they'd find ways to force her out through bureaucratic harassment. "Get out," Sarah said quietly. "I beg your pardon?" Mr. Blackwood asked. "I said get out of my cafe, now." The two men exchanged glances. Mr. Blackwood collected his papers and stood up. "We'll be in touch, Ms. Mitchell. When you change your mind, and you will, our offer may not be quite so generous." After they left, Sarah sank into a chair, her hands shaking. Mrs. Henderson, who had been listening from the kitchen, came out with a cup of tea. "Those were some nasty pieces of work," she said, setting the tea down. "But you stood up to them beautifully." "Did I?" Sarah asked. "Because I feel like I just made everything worse. First the commander threatens my business, and now these vultures are circling, waiting for me to fail." That afternoon brought another unwelcome visitor. A young man with a clipboard and an official badge knocked on the door just as Sarah was considering closing early. "Health Department," he announced. "We've received complaints about this establishment. I need to conduct a full inspection." Sarah knew her cafe was clean. She'd always been meticulous about health and safety standards, but she also knew that a determined inspector could find violations anywhere if they looked hard enough. The inspection took 3 hours. The inspector checked every corner, every appliance, every storage area. He measured temperatures, tested water and examined food storage containers with the thoroughness of someone looking for problems rather than ensuring compliance. In the end, he found violations. Minor things that had never been issues before, but enough to write up a substantial fine and order corrections within 10 days. "This is harassment," Sarah told him as he handed her the citation. "Ma'am, I just follow up on complaints," he replied, with a shrug. "Someone reported concerns about food safety, and it's my job to investigate." After he left, Sarah locked the door and put up the closed sign, even though it was only 4 in the afternoon. She sat alone in her empty cafe, surrounded by the tables and chairs she'd carefully chosen, the artwork from local artists she'd hung on the walls, the coffee machine she'd saved for months to buy. Everything she'd built was crumbling around her, and all because she'd shown kindness to someone who needed it. Mrs. Henderson knocked on the door and Sarah let her in. "I saw the inspector leave," she said. "How bad is it?" Sarah handed her the citation. Mrs. Henderson read it and shook her head. "This is ridiculous. Half of these things are completely normal. They're trying to force you out." "They're succeeding," Sarah said quietly. "I can't fight the naval base, Coastal Development Corporation, and the health department all at once. Maybe I should just take their offer and walk away. Sarah Mitchell, I've known you for 5 years and I've never seen you give up on anything." Mrs. Henderson said firmly, "You didn't give up when the old coffee machine broke down 3 times in 1 week. You didn't give up when that hurricane damaged the roof, and you're not going to give up now." "This is different," Sarah protested. "This isn't weather or equipment. These are powerful people who want me gone." "Then we'll find more powerful people who want you to stay," Mrs. Henderson declared. "There's something you don't know about Marcus Thompson, something I didn't think was important until now." Sarah looked up. "What do you mean?" "My nephew works at the base," Mrs. Henderson explained. "He told me something interesting about your friend Marcus, that security threat he discovered. It wasn't just any security threat. And Marcus isn't just any security guard." "What are you talking about?" Mrs. Henderson sat down across from Sarah. "Marcus Thompson is a former Royal Marine. He served 3 tours in Afghanistan before taking the security job to be closer to his family. And the security threat he stopped? It was a potential terrorist incident. Foreign agents trying to access classified submarine technology." Sarah stared at her. "Are you serious?" "Completely serious. Marcus saved lives, Sarah. Potentially thousands of lives. And he says he couldn't have done it without the kindness you showed him, giving him the strength to stay alert and focused." For the first time in days, Sarah felt a glimmer of hope. "But what difference does that make? Commander Walsh still has it in for me." Mrs. Henderson smiled mysteriously. "Well, that's where things get interesting. Because Marcus's former unit heard about what happened to him. And apparently Royal Marines don't like it when someone mistreats their own." Friday morning arrived with storm clouds gathering over the harbor. Sarah had barely slept, tossing and turning as she worried about the health department violations, the dwindling customer base, and the pressure from Coastal Development Corporation. She'd spent half the night going over her finances, trying to figure out how long she could survive without the naval base customers. The answer wasn't encouraging. At her current rate of income, she had maybe 6 weeks before she'd have to start missing payments on her business loan. She arrived at the cafe earlier than usual, hoping that throwing herself into work would quiet the anxious thoughts racing through her mind. As she unlocked the door, she noticed something odd. There were several cars parked along the street that hadn't been there the night before. Nice cars, but not the usual tourist vehicles she was accustomed to seeing. Mrs. Henderson arrived shortly after, carrying her usual bag of fresh flowers for the tables and wearing an expression that was equal parts excitement and nervousness. "Sarah, dear," she said as soon as she walked in, "I think you should know that my nephew called me very early this morning. Something's happening at the base. Something big." "What kind of something?" Sarah asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. Her week had already contained enough surprises. "He wouldn't give me details, but he said there are people asking questions about you. Important people. And not the kind who want to cause trouble." Before Sarah could respond, she heard the familiar chime of the door. She looked up expecting to see one of her remaining local customers, but instead saw Marcus Thompson. He looked different again, not just clean and pressed like the last time, but somehow more official. He wore his security uniform, but there was something about his posture and demeanor that seemed more military than civilian. "Marcus," Sarah said warmly, despite everything that had happened. "How are you doing?" "I'm well, Sarah, thank you," he replied, but his voice carried a formality that hadn't been there before. "I wanted to apologize for what happened with Commander Walsh. Her treatment of you was completely inappropriate." "It's not your fault," Sarah assured him. "You were just doing your job." Marcus nodded, but his expression remained serious. "Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I need you to trust me. Are you free this morning around 10 o'clock? Sarah gestured around the nearly empty cafe. "As you can see, I'm not exactly overbooked these days." "Why?" "Some people would like to meet with you. People who have heard about what you did for me and want to express their gratitude properly." "Marcus, I appreciate the thought, but I really don't need any more attention. The last time people wanted to thank me, it ended up making everything worse." Marcus stepped closer to the counter, and his voice dropped to a more personal tone. "Sarah, you saved my life. Not just with the food, though, that meant everything to me. You reminded me why I became a soldier in the first place. To protect good people like you. What I discovered that night at the base, the threat I was able to stop, I could never have done it if I hadn't had that conversation with you." "You're giving me too much credit," Sarah protested. "No, I'm not giving you enough," Marcus replied firmly. "And neither are the people who want to meet you. Please just give them 10 minutes. If you're uncomfortable, I'll make sure they leave." Immediately, Sarah looked at Mrs. Henderson, who nodded encouragingly. "I suppose 10 minutes wouldn't hurt," she agreed reluctantly. Marcus smiled for the first time since entering. "Thank you. They'll be here at 10 sharp." After Marcus left, Sarah spent the next hour in a state of nervous anticipation. Mrs. Henderson bustled around the cafe, tidying things that were already tidy and making sure everything was perfect. "Who do you think is coming?" Sarah asked as she wiped down the coffee machine for the third time. "I honestly don't know, dear," Mrs. Henderson replied, "but my nephew seemed very excited when he called. He kept saying this was going to change everything." At exactly 10 o'clock, Sarah heard the sound of vehicles pulling up outside. Multiple vehicles. She looked through the window and felt her breath catch. 3 black SUVs had parked in front of the cafe, along with the cars she'd noticed earlier that morning. The door chimed, and Marcus entered first, followed by a man in his 50s, wearing a perfectly pressed military uniform with more ribbons and insignia than Sarah had ever seen outside of a movie. Behind him came 2 more uniformed men and a woman in civilian clothes who carried herself with unmistakable authority. "Ms. Mitchell," the lead officer said in a crisp British accent, "I am Colonel James Hartwell of Her Majesty's Royal Marines. This is Major Richardson, Captain Malloy, and Agent Caroline Webb from the Ministry of Defense." Sarah felt her knees go weak. "Ministry of Defense, as in the British government?" "Indeed," Colonel Hartwell replied. "We've traveled quite some distance to meet you, Ms. Mitchell. May we sit down?" Sarah gestured to the largest table in the cafe, grateful that Mrs. Henderson had already prepared it with fresh flowers and clean place settings. As the group settled in, she noticed that 2 of the men remained standing near the door, clearly acting as security. Colonel Hartwell began without preamble. "Ms. Mitchell, Marine Thompson has told us about your kindness to him during a particularly difficult period in his life. He credits you with giving him the mental clarity and emotional strength to perform his duties at a critical moment. I just gave him some food and listened to his problems," Sarah said, still overwhelmed by the situation. "You gave him much more than that," Agent Webb interjected. Her voice was sharp but not unkind. "Marine Thompson's actions prevented what could have been a catastrophic security breach. The intelligence gathered from that incident has led to the disruption of a significant terrorist network." Major Richardson leaned forward. "What you did for one of our own has had ramifications far beyond what you could have imagined. The security, of both our nations has been enhanced because of your compassion." Sarah shook her head. "This is all very flattering, but I don't understand why you're here. Marcus did the important work. He's the hero in this story." Colonel Hartwell smiled. Marine Thompson would disagree. In fact, he's been quite insistent that we address the treatment you've received since this incident came to light. "We understand. You face some challenges with local authorities?" Sarah felt a flush of embarrassment. "It's nothing I can't handle." Commander Walsh's actions were completely inappropriate, Captain Malloy said firmly. "Threatening a civilian for showing kindness to military personnel goes against everything we stand for." Agent Webb pulled out a tablet and scrolled through some information. "We've also become aware of pressure from a development company and unusual health department scrutiny. This pattern suggests a coordinated effort to drive you from your business." "And you investigated all that?" Sarah asked, amazed. "Ms. Mitchell," Colonel Hartwell said seriously, "when someone helps one of our people and then faces retaliation for it, we take that very seriously indeed. The Royal Marines don't abandon their friends, and we don't forget our debts." Mrs. Henderson, who had been quietly serving tea and trying not to eavesdrop, whispered to Sarah, "I told you Royal Marines take care of their own." Colonel Hartwell overheard and smiled. "Your employee is quite correct, Ms. Mitchell, which brings us to why we're really here." Colonel Hartwell reached into his briefcase and pulled out an official-looking document with impressive seals and ribbons. "Ms. Mitchell, by the authority vested in me by Her Majesty's government, and in recognition of your contribution to national security, I am honored to present you with the Civilian Service Medal for Exceptional Merit." Sarah stared at the medal and certificate, her mouth falling open. "I don't understand. This seems way too important for what I did." "Let me explain exactly what you did," Agent Webb said, opening her tablet again. "The information Marine Thompson gathered that night led us to uncover a cell of foreign agents who had been planning attacks on military installations in 3 countries. They had already infiltrated security at 2 other bases and were hours away from accessing classified submarine technology that could have been sold to hostile nations. Major Richardson continued the explanation. "The ripple effects of stopping that operation have been enormous. We've prevented potential terrorist attacks, protected military secrets, and disrupted an international espionage ring. All because Marine Thompson was alert and mentally prepared to notice something others might have missed. And he's told us repeatedly that he couldn't have done it without you," Captain Malloy added. "You gave him hope when he had none left. You reminded him of his worth as a person and as a soldier." Colonel Hartwell leaned forward. "But we're not here just to give you a medal, Ms. Mitchell. We're here to address the injustices you've faced and to make sure they never happen again." As if on cue, Sarah heard more vehicles pulling up outside. Through the window, she could see additional official cars and what looked like news vans arriving. "What's happening out there?" she asked nervously. Agent Webb smiled for the first time since entering. "Justice, Ms. Mitchell, and accountability." The door chimed again, and to Sarah's shock, Commander Walsh walked in, followed by several other naval officers she didn't recognize. But Commander Walsh looked very different from the confident, threatening woman who had visited the café earlier that week. She appeared pale and subdued, and the officers with her clearly outranked her. "Ms. Mitchell," one of the new officers said, stepping forward. "I am Admiral Harrison, commanding officer of the Naval District. I am here to formally apologize for the inexcusable treatment you received from personnel under my command." Commander Walsh was clearly uncomfortable, but stepped forward as instructed. "Ms. Mitchell, I owe you a personal apology. My actions this week were inappropriate, unprofessional, and completely contrary to military values. I threatened you for showing kindness to one of our security personnel, and that was wrong." Admiral Harrison continued. "Commander Walsh has been relieved of her position and will face disciplinary action. Her threats against your business were not authorized by the Navy and do not represent our values or policies." Sarah was speechless. The woman who had seemed so powerful and intimidating just days ago now appeared small and ashamed in front of her superiors. "Furthermore," Admiral Harrison said, "effective immediately, Seaside Café is designated as a preferred establishment for naval base personnel. Any service member who wishes to patronize your business has the full support and encouragement of the command structure. The door chimed once more, and Mr. Blackwood and Mr. Stevens from Coastal Development Corporation entered, looking far less confident than they had during their previous visit. Behind them came several people in suits who were clearly law enforcement. "Mr. Blackwood," Agent Webb said without looking up from her tablet, "how nice to see you again. I believe you have something to discuss with Ms. Mitchell?" Mr. Blackwood's usually smooth demeanor had completely disappeared. He looked nervous and kept glancing at the law enforcement officers. "Ms. Mitchell, I need to apologize for our approach. Earlier this week, Coastal Development Corporation withdraws any and all offers for your property, and we will not be pursuing development in this area. That's because Coastal Development Corporation is currently under investigation for conspiracy, harassment, and attempting to manipulate local government officials," one of the federal agents said. "Mr. Blackwood, you'll need to come with us for questioning." As the two developers were escorted out, another official Sarah didn't recognize stepped forward. "Ms. Mitchell, I'm Inspector Davies from the County Health Department. I'm here to personally review the citation issued to your establishment this week." He pulled out the violation report and made a show of tearing it in half. "This citation was issued improperly and has been voided. The inspector who conducted this harassment, masquerading as an inspection, has been suspended pending investigation. Your establishment has always maintained excellent health and safety standards." Sarah felt overwhelmed by the rapid succession of revelations and reversals. "I don't know what to say. This is all happening so fast." Colonel Hartwell stood up and addressed the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, if you'll allow us a few moments of privacy with Ms. Mitchell." The various officials began filing out, leaving only the Royal Marines, Agent Webb, Marcus, and Mrs. Henderson in the café. The sudden quiet felt almost deafening after all the commotion. "Sarah," Marcus said, speaking for the first time since the officials arrived, "I need you to understand something. What happened to you this week was my fault. If I hadn't told people about your kindness, none of this would have happened." "Marcus, don't you dare blame yourself," Sarah said firmly. "You did nothing wrong by being grateful." "Perhaps, Colonel," Hartwell interjected, "but Marine Thompson raises an important point. Your kindness to him set off a chain of events that exposed corruption and incompetence at multiple levels. Commander Walsh's abuse of power, the development company's illegal pressure tactics, the health department's harassment, all of it came to light because people were paying attention to how you were being treated." Agent Webb nodded. "Sometimes it takes a spotlight to reveal the shadows, Miss Mitchell. Your situation became that spotlight." "There's something else," Major Richardson said. "The story of what you did for Marine Thompson and how you were treated afterward has attracted quite a bit of attention. There are reporters outside who would very much like to speak with you," Sarah groaned. "I really don't want to be famous, I just want to run my cafe." "That's entirely your choice," Colonel Hartwell assured her. "But you should know that your story has inspired people. Sometimes the world needs to be reminded that small acts of kindness matter, and that good people shouldn't be punished for doing the right thing." Mrs. Henderson, who had been unusually quiet during all the revelations, finally spoke up. "Sarah, dear, I think you should consider it. Not for the fame, but for what it represents. You stood up to bullies and won. Other people facing similar situations need to see that it's possible." Sarah looked around at the faces surrounding her, people who had traveled from across the ocean to thank her for something she considered a simple human gesture. Outside she could hear the murmur of reporters and the clicking of cameras. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" she asked. Colonel Hartwell smiled. "We're asking you to accept the recognition you deserve, to let people know that kindness has power, and that sometimes doing the right thing leads to extraordinary consequences," Agent Webb added, "and we're asking you to let us make sure this never happens to anyone else. The investigation into the corruption you uncovered is going to send a strong message that intimidating good people has serious consequences." Sarah took a deep breath and looked out at her cafe, the place she'd poured her heart into for 8 years. It was still the same cozy space with the harbor view and the smell of fresh coffee, but somehow everything had changed. "All right," she said finally. "I'll talk to the reporters. but only if Marcus is with me. None of this would have happened without his courage. Marcus stepped forward and saluted Colonel Hartwell. Sir, I'd be honored to stand with Sarah when she meets the press. Excellent, Colonel Hartwell replied, returning the salute. Marine Thompson, you've served your country with distinction, both in combat and in civilian life. Both nations owe you a debt of gratitude. As the group prepared to face the waiting reporters, Mrs. Henderson grabbed Sarah's arm. I'm so proud of you, dear. Your grandmother would be proud too. You've proven that kindness really can change the world. Sarah squeezed her hand. We're not done yet, Mrs. Henderson. Something tells me this is just the beginning. 6 months later, Sarah stood behind the counter of Seaside Café, watching the morning rush with a mixture of amazement and gratitude. The cafe was busier than it had ever been, filled with a mix of naval personnel, local residents, tourists, and people who had traveled from far away just to visit the place they'd heard about in the news. The transformation had been remarkable. After the press conference that day with Colonel Hartwell and Marcus, the story had spread around the world. The cafe owner who saved national security with kindness had become an international sensation, inspiring copycat acts of generosity and bringing attention to the power of simple human compassion. But more than the fame, Sarah was proud of the changes that had come to her community. The investigation sparked by her situation had rooted out corruption in several local government offices. The health department had been completely restructured, with new oversight to prevent harassment of small businesses. Commander Walsh had been court-martialed and dismissed from service, while Admiral Harrison had implemented new policies to protect civilians who showed kindness to military personnel. Marcus had been promoted and transferred to a position that better suited his skills and experience. His ex-wife, moved by the public attention and his renewed confidence, had agreed to shared custody of their daughter. His mother's medical bills had been covered by a fund established by grateful government officials and private donors. Sarah, Table 6 needs their check, Mrs. Henderson called out, her voice cheerful as she bustled between tables. The elderly woman had become something of a local celebrity herself, giving interviews about her role in encouraging Sarah to stand up to the bullies. Sarah grabbed the check and walked over to Table 6, where a young couple sat with their 2 small children. The family had driven 3 hours just to eat at the cafe after hearing Sarah's story. Everything was wonderful, the woman said as Sarah handed over the check. Thank you for what you did. It gives us hope that there are still good people in the world. We're all capable of goodness, Sarah replied with a smile. Sometimes we just need reminding. As the family left, Sarah noticed a familiar figure entering the cafe. Marcus Thompson walked in wearing civilian clothes, looking relaxed and happy, in a way she hadn't seen since that first difficult morning 6 months ago. Marcus, Sarah called out warmly. How was your weekend with Emma? Marcus's face lit up at the mention of his daughter. It was perfect. We went to the zoo and she rode every ride at the amusement park twice. She wants to come visit the famous cafe next weekend. She's welcome any time, Sarah assured him. The usual? Actually, I'll have whatever you recommend, Marcus said, settling into his old corner table by the window. I trust your judgment completely. As Sarah prepared his order, she reflected on how much had changed. The corner table where Marcus used to sit in despair was now marked with a small plaque that read, Hope Begins Here, donated by a veterans organization that had been inspired by their story. The cafe itself had been renovated with the help of donations from around the world. The kitchen was larger, the dining area had been expanded, and there was now a small library corner where customers could read books donated by supporters. A wall displayed letters and photos from people who had been inspired to perform their own acts of kindness. Sarah, Mrs. Henderson called from behind the register. There's someone here to see you. Sarah looked up to see a young woman in military fatigues approaching the counter. She looked nervous but determined. Ms. Mitchell, the woman said, I'm Corporal Jennifer Hayes. I just wanted to thank you for what you did for Marcus, and to tell you that your story inspired me to help a fellow soldier who was going through a tough time. Because of what you showed us about kindness, I was able to recognize when someone needed help. Sarah smiled warmly. That's wonderful, Corporal Hayes. How is your friend doing? Much better, ma'am. And because I knew to look for the signs of someone struggling, we were able to get him the support he needed before it was too late. Stories like this had become common. Sarah received letters almost daily from people around the world who had been inspired by her example to show kindness to others. Teachers helping struggling students, neighbors checking on elderly residents, strangers buying meals for the homeless. The ripple effects seemed endless. As the lunch crowd began to arrive, Sarah noticed a familiar black SUV pulling up outside. Colonel Hartwell stepped out, followed by a woman in civilian clothes she didn't recognize. Colonel Hartwell? Sarah greeted him as he entered. What brings you back to our little cafe? Ms. Mitchell, he said with his usual formal courtesy. I'd like you to meet Dr. Elizabeth Warren from Oxford University. She's writing a book about the social impact of individual acts of kindness, and your story features prominently in her research. Dr. Warren stepped forward with an academic's enthusiasm. Ms. Mitchell, your case has become a textbook example of how one person's compassion can create massive positive change. We've documented over 3,000 individual acts of kindness that people have attributed directly to being inspired by your story. That's incredible, Sarah said, genuinely amazed. I had no idea it had spread so far. There's something else, Colonel Hartwell added. The Prime Minister would like to invite you to London to speak at a conference on community resilience. Your story has become part of policy discussions about supporting small businesses and protecting Good Samaritans from retaliation. Sarah felt the familiar flutter of nervousness that came with these high-profile requests. I'm honored, but I'm not really a public speaker. I'm just a cafe owner. You're much more than that, Dr. Warren said. You're proof that ordinary people can do extraordinary things simply by choosing kindness over indifference. Marcus, who had been listening from his table, stood up and approached. Sarah, I think you should do it. Not for the recognition, but because people need to hear that kindness matters, that it has real power to change things. He's right, Mrs. Henderson chimed in from across the cafe. Your story gives people hope. In these troubled times, hope is exactly what the world needs. Sarah looked around at her cafe, filled with the chatter of happy customers, the smell of fresh coffee, and the warmth of community. 6 months ago, she had thought her world was ending. Now it felt like it was just beginning. All right, she said finally. I'll go to London, but only if Marcus comes with me. We're a team in this story. Colonel Hartwell smiled. I think that can be arranged, Marine Thompson. As the afternoon wore on and the cafe filled with its usual mix of locals, tourists, and people making pilgrimages to see the place where kindness had sparked an international movement, Sarah felt a deep sense of contentment. She had learned that sometimes the smallest gestures have the biggest impact, and that standing up for what's right, even when it's scary, can lead to extraordinary consequences. The young security guard who had sat at her corner table 6 months ago, broken and hopeless, was now a symbol of resilience and second chances. The simple act of giving someone a free meal when they needed it had exposed corruption, inspired thousands of acts of kindness, and reminded the world that compassion is never wasted. As she wiped down the counter for the last time that day, Sarah smiled at the plaque by the window that had become the cafe's unofficial motto, donated by a group of schoolchildren who had raised money for a local food bank after hearing her story. Kindness is a language that everyone can understand and everyone can speak. Tomorrow would bring new customers, new stories, and new opportunities to make a difference. Sarah had learned that heroes aren't born from grand gestures or dramatic moments, but from the simple decision to help when help is needed, regardless of the consequences. And sometimes, just sometimes, those small acts of kindness can change the entire world.